So tell me, can you see my slides? Yeah, I hope you can. So let's just start. So hello everyone, my name is Michał Furmankiewicz. Today I'm going to talk with you about some security in the cloud, and I would like to reveal some facts that you probably know, but maybe you are not aware how much they can impact your environment. So as you probably have seen, we have a couple of sponsors in here. So thank you guys for helping us to organize this thing. So we have ScriptRunner, Global Driving Data Quality, Proximo, Redspire, Agilicis. Hopefully I know how to pronounce that name. Hitachi Solutions. So thank you guys again. And a couple of words about myself. So I'm a geek and architect with passion to technology. This is how I usually looks like. As you can see, similarly, I'm a community member and organizer of some local events in Poland. I come from Poland, so hopefully my pronunciation will be good enough for you to understand. I'm a former Microsoft full-time employee. I spent 12 years there. Right now, I'm Microsoft MVP, and I'm helping different customers in Poland mostly, but in some in Europe to build cloud strategies, governance, architecture. On a daily basis, I'm working as a head of consulting in Cloud State, and I'm the owner of Cloud Architects. I'm doing some consultancy job as well. So let's go to the agenda straight ahead. So I've promised to deliver 10 facts, which are maybe less known in Azure, when you can find some areas, some security issues with them. And those 10 areas are, so I'm going to start with the governance, go through the services, then talk about SPN and managed identity, talk about custom roles, networking, and Azure ID configuration. And if I will have enough time, maybe I will cover service monitoring, Azure automation, and Azure policy, and other exfiltration. So this is all the areas which I'm going to talk about. As you can see, they are very specific. So as I noted on the session, on the agenda, this is 300 level session. Probably it's around 300, but I'm not going to cover the basics. I'm just going to deep inside every of this point and give you some ideas why you should be careful about all of them. So okay, why I'm doing this session? Well, if you look through those big companies who are analyzing how the market is evolving, you will see that still 95 security issues which happens in the cloud environment are because of the users which use those environments, or because of the lack of the knowledge of the people who are configuring this environment. Even Microsoft has this problem. So their Microsoft support service were impacted because the engineer at Microsoft configured the NSG badly on some VMs in Azure, and some data were leaked about support cases. And Gartner says that in 2023, this number will even increase. So it seems that education, understanding how the cloud services works, is a crucial link here. What also is quite important, I think that lots of companies, while they are doing their foundation, when they are preparing the foundation for themselves, and they are investing money to build that foundation, it seems that most of the companies say that the security aspect of the foundation is the biggest concern, is the biggest area which they wanted to cover. Because security is also about monitoring, is also about how do you handle the issues you will have, how do you respond to those issues, lots of things, and there is a lot of processes around. That's why I thought that it's valid to talk about this part. And of course, there are lots of areas which people know, but they still happen, and they happen all the time for the newcomers and in the environment. So I think it's valid, as I said, to repeat that and repeat again. And the last but not least, which is also very, very important, I think the cloud offering, which you can see right now on the market, is only getting bigger and bigger. And those architectures which you are guys building are getting more complicated. So there is a lot of work for security people and monitoring people to handle all those new places when the issues can arise. So I think the security team have lots of things to do in the cloud all the time, because it evolves so fast. So let's jump into the topics which I prepared for you, and let me cover some of them for you. So first of all, I want to start with governance and foundation. This is not known fact. This is rather a concept of building a governance and foundation architecture for your environment. But I want to I want to point out a couple of things which I think are very, very important when you are doing that for your company. This is some kind of a learning which I have for the last 5 years when I'm focusing on building this stuff. So first of all, when you're building a governance and foundation, you need to include your security team into the conversation. Without this security team, without the right team of specialists, which will be using those cloud services and this cloud architecture in your organization, you will not be successful. If you think that you can, close yourself in a room for next 6 months and build everything, document everything, but you will not test that with the end customer, you will not be successful. Because it's not only about to build a secure foundation and secure governance, it's also about usability for the end customers, for the developers, for the team which is using those services to build services for themselves. So it's a key to include very wide team in that process. I know it's not easy and you will have lots of hassle, but it's really key. And the second thing is to go with the team through all the aspects. So what I see in many cases is that when you're starting building the governance and you're going through all those aspects, people are very distracted in many areas because they don't have this as deep knowledge as you may have when you're building this with them. So it's a key to engage them and cover all the areas and talk with them about all the areas to make sure that they really understand what consequences it may have when they decide about this specific architecture of your governance and foundation. And it's even more important, it's important to document those important facts, but it's even more important to test your infrastructure. I've been in the projects when the security team hardened the infrastructure so much that we were not able to run most of the services. Well, we were able to run some of the services, but the subset was so small that we were challenging why we need the cloud infrastructure to be used if we have so limited possibilities. So I encourage everyone to test the infrastructure with your end customer as soon as possible when you are building this infrastructure. From the security perspective as well, because your security team will have to learn how to monitor this environment, how to get the security events out of this environment, how to prepare the procedures, because otherwise they will not know how to keep this infrastructure secure, and they will not be able to to help their developers to be successful once the cloud will be there. And the thing which is maybe not that obvious for many customers is, I think it's valid to build an internal team of people who who are usually called some DevOps engineers. I hate that name, so I'm omitting that intentionally. I think it's good to build a team who understands the governance and foundation, but also understands what services are required by development teams and are helping to bring the products. I mean the products. So I mean services ready to use by your developers. So they don't have to learn all Terraform stuff. They don't have to learn about the ARM stuff, and they don't have to learn how the foundation is built. I see a crucial role of that kind of a team. Otherwise, what you will get at the end is you will have a beautiful foundation, but not very easy understandable by your developer teams. And then you don't have this link, so they don't know how to build the services which they can be used in that environment. And so those are my learnings, and right now I'll try to dig into some of those areas which I think you should think of because they may be very impactful for your environment from the security aspect. So okay, let's start with something which is probably very widely used, but many orgs, many big corporations, when they see how this SPN and managed identity is working technically, they are starting to ask difficult questions, and then you see that you don't have good answers how to answer them. So let's define the problem. What the problem I'm defining in here. So probably most of you know that SPN is a service principal name. Service principal name is let's call them a technical account, which is used by you, by your automation services, by some Azure services like AKS, like OpenShift, like like many others. And there's also managed identity, which is actually working similarly to SPN, but SPN is using a secret, or it's using a certificate to authenticate to Azure AD. But managed identity is using exactly the same secret, but the secret is kept only in Azure AD. It's never revealed, and it can only be used by services built in Azure. So like VM can use a managed identity. So in many cases, you will see that you will have to use SPN for the automation for your services. So they are widely used. They're used by many services, as I said, and they are also used by developers who are building solutions on Azure. So they need those SPNs for the to build that solution, to communicate somehow with Azure services. But what are the risks when you're using an SPN? Well, there are many of them, but lots of people are concerned that there is no technical means to control how you use those SPNs. You cannot use conditional access in Azure AD. You cannot use PIM, so privileged identity management, to control those accounts. You cannot use identity governance. You cannot use identity protection. All those nice features of Azure AD will work perfectly for your user accounts. They will work perfectly for your security groups, but they will not work at all for your SPNs. Which is very, very understandable. SPN is a technical account, so you don't it's not easy to use the second factor or to use conditional access, because you use this account for automation processes, for non-interactive logins, right? But if you will lose this kind of SPN it's not that easy to track this SPN. And what may happen that if you build your automation around the cloud and you use many SPN accounts, use many repo resources to provision your infrastructure, then it may mean that you have lots of those SPNs, and you may lose one or the other. And in many cases, it's not easy to track that this SPN is used in a different way by some other entities, and they are doing some malicious stuff. So you can see right now in here that, for example, I've created the SPN. I've created one of the SPNs, VSS 2021. And as you can see, I'm using this SPN to log in from some specific address IP to Azure services to do some work. So finally, what we have for SPN, we can control. We always had this possibility, but right now in Azure AD we can see those logins done by those SPNs into Azure. But what actually can be done to limit how people are using this SPN? Well, before I will jump into this, let's see another picture. Here you can see other SPNs created for example, Azure Automation Service, which is also used from different IP addresses. Here you can see the SPN created for AKS, for Azure Kubernetes Services, and this SPN is used from some IP address used by Azure. So what I'm trying to say is that if you're using SPN, and you will use those SPNs because many services will use them, as you can see, you can at least somehow control from which places those SPN are used. Even though you cannot do much to limit this activity if you don't know that, for example, this SPN has been taken by. And for example, for Azure Automation, this SPN has pretty high permissions for Azure, because by default, Azure SPN for Azure Automation is the contributor for the whole subscription you have. So what you can see, what you can do to somehow think of those SPNs. Finally, you can monitor how they are used. As you can see, you have a place in Azure AD when you have the whole list of SPNs used, and you have the whole log to see how they are used. You can also think about limiting the IP addresses from which those SPNs are used only to those which are used by your organization. So you can, for example, think, okay, if I know the public IP addresses of my organization and the people are using those SPNs from, to log into my automation accounts from my org, then maybe I can monitor the usage of those and maybe I can create the incident if any of those SPNs has been used from the other IP address, which is not a part of my organization. Can you block this SPN if it's used from the other IP than your org IP? Yes, you can. You have to do some automation around that. You have to do some custom solution, but there is a possibility to limit those activities and to create the incident every single time you have this happening within your SPNs. You may say, okay, Michał, but we also have this managed identities. In many cases, you can use managed identity. You are right. You can use managed identity in many areas, but it's not that easy to use those managed identities for the services or the automations you are running, which are running outside of Azure. In Azure, you can for your custom solutions. Outside of Azure, it's impossible. So actually, probably you will have to stay with these SPNs. You can think about certs instead of secrets, which can help you to protect your SPNs in a better way. But still, think about monitoring and think about the process of giving out those SPNs, because if you will give this SPN in a bad hands, let's call it this way, you may have interesting things happening in your subscription. Okay, so this was about SPNs. This was about how to protect them. Let's go and find another thing which may be a problem with your organization. So custom roles. Probably lots of you guys are using roles in Azure. You are using RBAC, so you're using role-based access control system to define roles for your different users. And from time to time, you probably need to create a custom role, because you have some specific requirements for some activities the user will need to do in your subscription. So custom roles I can see that people are more often using those custom roles to limit the account's permissions and limit the team responsibilities. I often see the expectation that every single part of the services or every single service in Azure will have some dedicated role which is responsible for creating that service, managing that service, maybe monitoring that service. So those big corporations are creating lots of those roles to cover different aspects of running those services in Azure. Microsoft, on the other hand, is saying that they recommend using built-in roles. Why they are saying that? Well, because if you use built-in role and something is changing in the service, and this change in the service impacts the way that this role is defined, then Microsoft will do that automatically for you. If you have a custom role and you have not updated your role to the latest service you have in Azure, your role may not work properly. I mean, well, if it's defined, it will work, but if you will try to update it from Terraform or ARM, it will not work perfectly. But so what issues I can see with custom roles, even though I'm implementing lots of them in environments? So please have a look below how you can define the custom role with the name and how it may be used in an improper way. Well, actually, I'm not the owner of this discovery. Well, lots of people talked on different places that this is an issue. So I'm not the only one, but look how this is tricky. So if you will look carefully, let me do this like this. This is a built-in role which is called reader, right? Nothing really fancy about that. This is my custom role, which name is reader. Actually, its name is not reader exactly. You cannot use the same name for the role if the role has already been defined. Actually, this name of this role is white space. Then you have reader, and here you have another space, another empty sign, right? But if you will look at the UI, actually both of those roles looks the same. There is not much difference in both of them. But in a second, you will see that this reader role, it's as I said, it's defined like this. And please have a look what permissions I've assigned to this role, right? It's pretty tricky to navigate to see that just by looking through the roles you've defined. And let me show you another. Excuse me. I have another thing in here. I have to close the show just for a second. Let me do like this. I want to show you something. Sorry, guys. This is just because of my bad animation in the slides. So as you can see, this is another definition of the role, which can be very, very tricky. So I said it's not a virtual machine operator, right? But please have a look how this role is defined. So my statement is, if you're using custom roles, you have to be careful how they are defined, because they can be defined in a tricky way, and you may have issues. Excuse me, and you may have issues to see what those roles are really doing. But there is another case with the roles. So let me come back to my slides. So what you actually can do to limit this kind of behavior, you should probably limit the number of people who can create custom roles in your environment, because as you can see, they can be tricky. You should probably limit the way you create every new role, because you probably not always need that. If you need a new role, okay, probably you should think why you need this role and why you cannot use the built-in role. You can, of course, control the list of custom actions which are available for every service. Why I'm talking about this? Because as I said before, when you're using custom roles, then you may have this issue with updating the role. If the new service will happen, if the Microsoft will create a new service and you want to cover that service in your roles, then you probably have to add something. But if the Microsoft is changing the way they are delivering this role, what you need to do is to change the definition, right? Because you have some actions which are no longer used by Microsoft. But also, what I think is also valid to do when you're using custom roles and you are defining different roles, probably think about identity governance. This is the service which can help you to validate what actions and roles are assigned to users. But also, I think we should monitor the role usage and role assignments, because even if you use those custom roles, it's valid to check if those people who need those roles really need them. So monitoring of usage, monitoring of assignments, this is something which is also very, very important. And the last but not least, excuse me, but the last but not least is probably if you are using custom roles, then you should be very careful how do you apply them. So everything should go through the code. You can also use gates in your deployment to validate the code of those roles, not to limit these possibilities like I've shown. And maybe it's good to validate those roles and check roles which have too many different actions assigned. So I cannot give you a proper one single advice how you should do that in your environment. You have to think about about your strategy for roles, but those are some of those issues around roles when you're using them in your environment. So, okay, let's move on. Let's go to another area, which is also very tricky. I would say it's networking, its design, and the tab solutions. So networking, why I'm talking about networking, why I would said it's something which is a bit unknown. Well, it's not unknown. Lots of people know how to do the networking in Azure, but I would say that networking in any cloud, not only in Azure, but in any cloud, but here I'm talking about Azure, is so key in your deployment that unless you are a small startup, one army startup, then the networking is defining the way you can use services, is defining the way how you can monitor the communication between those services, is the key to understand if some infiltration happened, how this infiltration happened in your environment. So what I see also because of the networking, why it's so important, is that customers are not really worried that the Azure services will be attacked. Well, they can be attacked by some external people, but they believe that Microsoft is capable of defending themselves. But I think the problem which the customer sees is rather different. So they are worried about the data exfiltration. So they are worried that if the service if from the service I can easily reach to the internet, or I can reach to any other network, I can do some data exfiltration, or I can it may lead to the compromised environment. So if you have a multi-region deployment with various on-prem DCs, networking gets very complicated, and I think it's one of those points when you should spend a lot of time. Let me show you a couple of problems when you are thinking about different services which are using networking in Azure. I will also cover that during my another part of this talk, when I will be talking about internet access from different services. So well, this is what you see so probably this is what you have seen many times. This is the overall generic Azure virtual data center proposed by Microsoft, showing all the parts which are possible in Azure from the networking perspective. As you can see, plenty of things on this picture, lots of the places which needs to be controlled and validated before you will deploy that solution to the internet, to the Azure. But what I also see is that this is very, very generic, and this it gives you some idea how you want to do that in your environment. But in customers' environment, there are a couple of issues which you really want to validate. The first one is how you will reach the internet, or do you really need to reach the internet, from your Azure environment? Maybe you can, but maybe it's better to use the internet through your on-prem DC. How you will connect with your different DCs all around. So this is another aspect which is also part of a discussion. How you will connect from this place to your other cloud provider. And what I usually see when people are trying to define this type of architecture is that they don't necessarily understand what services can be used to limit different parts of networking. And even if they think about that, then they forget that without proper monitoring, you can limit whatever you like, but you will have no data. So when the attack will appear, or when someone will try to access your environment, you will have absolutely no data to validate how the connection from where the connection came from, who was trying to set up this connection, what data has been transferred, and so on and so on. Because as I said, without monitoring, you know nothing. You're just limiting the traffic. Please have a look. This is some diagram of a possible architecture where I'm connecting Azure and Oracle. As you can see, different peerings in here, different networks, different subnets, things around. But what I also want to say that in Azure, when you are trying to build this kind of infrastructure, you have to think about different subscriptions. So as you can see, at least 4 subscriptions are used in Azure, different compartments in Oracle. Why I'm showing you this picture? Because I think even the hub and spoke architecture seems to be a proper solution for many organizations. When you will talk with your customer and you will try to figure out what the architecture will look like, you will see different approaches to things like, okay, how we're gonna resolve the DNS names in this architecture. Maybe we can resolve them on-prem. Maybe we want to have a dedicated server in here. How do you resolve the names which are available only on-prem? How do you resolve the names which are available in Oracle Cloud? Many of those aspects needs to be talked about, and then you will see that there are lots of places which you will have to monitor and harden before you will deploy that to the production. So what possibilities you have when you're talking about networking? Well, at least you need to have, you need to think about NSG logs, or better think about flow logs from Network Watcher, because they are much more rich in terms of the data you can get. Think about external solutions. Even though Microsoft is of course recommending their web application firewall for layer 7, even though Microsoft is recommending Azure firewall, their Azure firewall to limit the traffic between services, you may find out that that there are better options from typical networking vendors, and they are at this similar pricing level, which is great for you because they usually have more and more possibilities. So at the end of the day, what I would like to really to think of when you will define your networking next time, think about the logs. Without logs, you are really you know nothing. You are limiting your traffic. You're limiting you through NSG, but you don't have any knowledge. Think about private endpoints. Of course, right now you can use private endpoints for many services. You cannot use NSG to limit the traffic between private endpoints, but at least you can use NSG, attach it to the subnet where you have a private endpoint, and turn the logging on, so you can have lots of logs gathered about the traffic which is going through your private endpoint. And the last but not least, well, in many financial services organizations, I was asked about the TAP solution in Azure. Until December, if I'm not mistaken, last year, you had this proposal and it's been in preview, but the preview has been closed, unfortunately. And right now, you don't have any real TAP solution in Azure. So you have to, if you need this type of solution, you have to build it by yourself. And the last but not least, if you are thinking about the global networking from the, global monitoring for the networking perspective, think also that you will enlarge your infrastructure to many subscriptions. So maybe one day you will have to build something like a dedicated place to gather all the logs from different subscriptions in one place to analyze them, because you will not be able to grow your infrastructure. I've seen customers, not in Poland, but abroad, who are using 400 different subscriptions, and their networking gets really complicated. So without this concept of a cloud broker, which will gather all the logs in one place, it will be very difficult for you to really understand the security posture of your networking. I'm not going to cover that drawing in the details. You will find similar like this in many places, but I'm trying to tell you that this overall strategy for monitoring your networking, this is a key to be successful in that. Okay, let's move on. And instead of talking to the slides, I will change the approach. Let me open. Okay. Let me open the. I hope you can see my page right now. Let me open the Azure AD in my one of my tenants and show you a couple of ideas about the Azure AD configuration, which are usually missed and they can be important. If you go to Azure AD, first thing you wanna check maybe is the section properties and check if the Azure Access Management to Azure Resources is guaranteed for those who have who are global admins of your Azure AD. In some cases you want it. In many cases you don't want that. So please double check what's the option turned on in here. The second thing, which I think is pretty nasty, to be honest, at least up to me, it's here, because what you can see is that if you go to user settings, now you can check what users, just typical users, can do in your Azure AD. And one thing which is a bit annoying is that the typical user can register the application, so they can actually create an SPN in Azure AD. And even though they cannot, assign any permissions to that SPN, it's probably a bit difficult to understand why those users needs to create those app registration. I know what was the motivation behind at Microsoft, but I think this is probably something you need to think of turning off. Also, what I don't think is very valuable is the LinkedIn account connections. Well, maybe for some companies, but in many of those orgs, LinkedIn accounts connecting to Azure AD resources, Azure resources, this is not required. And the second thing, the third thing, which I think you need to look of, is external users. If you will click on that guy, you will see that. Excuse me. You will see that. Have a look. That even the users, even the members or guests can invite another guest, and members can invite another guest. So actually, by just inviting one guest, you can see lots of guests happening in Azure AD. I don't think this is the thing which you would like to have. So I'm really limiting that to to those who have invite role in my orgs. And also, I'm trying to limit the number of people who can send the invitation to different domains for my Azure AD. So I'm defining my domains very strictly to tell from which orgs I would like people to invite invite external people to my org. So those are just a couple of those configurations which I think are not oftenly analyzed, but they can be very painful when you will see them in your environment. Another part of this, which cannot be configured from the portal but can be configured using PowerShell, is the time you have your token valid. So of course it's easier for us to use long tokens, and you don't need to reassign re-log into your Azure AD again if you log in for once. But in many cases, when people like to keep those tokens and cached, this is not what you want to get. So limiting those tokens, the life of those tokens, is something you can think of to harden your Azure AD configuration. And this is what I'm talking about in this area. That basically because lots of breaches to Azure are happening because of Azure AD. This is the first service you need to harden really and to configure in your way. So accessing Azure AD can lead to many risks, to many issues. So I think you have to also think how you will gather and review audit log, how you will review activity log, how you will control the configuration, at least one of those configurations I've showed you. So there are lots of things you have to rethink around Azure AD. There are great services like identity protection, conditional access, or PIM, which you can use to do that at a different level. And if people will tell you that using PIM is very difficult, just show them how it's really working, because I've had lots of those situations that after showing them how they can easily elevate the permissions but work with very little permissions can help them, and how easy it is to use that after that I really get some people on board with that possibility. Well, I also think about Azure AD configuration. Even though Sentinel is a great tool and it can analyze the logs from Azure AD in a great way, probably there are some situations which may happen in your org and which may lead to the data to the identity leak. And Sentinel team have not thought about that. So I encourage you to think about the queries in Sentinel and analytics in Sentinel, your own custom queries who will analyze the logs and will analyze the issues you may have with your environment. Excuse me, I shouldn't go out from the presentation mode. So we have two more things to cover, and we have like 7 minutes. So I should have at least 2 or 3 to cover some questions. Services. So Azure has a lot of services, and you know that. Every service is a new adventure when it comes to security. Really, I mean, every single service has lots of those features you need to configure to make sure that the service is hardened. People love PaaS services, and PaaS services also has lots of features which can be used to help you with the security of those services. When you are thinking about every service like PaaS service, I think you should also think about how it's using the networking, how the service can be augmented through permissions. Excuse me, how the service is using identity, how you can log activities on this service. And there are some services offered by Microsoft in Azure which are actually not really hosted by Microsoft or are not 100% delivered by Microsoft. So for some of them, you can expect a bit different experience, and you should also think about them when you're implementing them. I'm not saying they are bad in some way. I'm not trying to even say that or make that kind of impression. No, I'm just saying that some of those services have different, small things which may be crucial for you. So I'm trying to put them out. For example, Azure DevOps have a great service which is called App Center Test. In App Center, you can, for example, test some mobile apps on the mobile phones delivered as a service in Azure. But you need to know that those places when those phones are placed are not Azure, are not Microsoft entities. I mean, this is the service delivered by a third party who was bought by Microsoft, but those phones are not sitting in Microsoft data centers. Of course, you have lots of knowledge about them. You have lots of information about how they deliver that service, but this is not a Microsoft service at the end of the day. It's not hosted by Microsoft. So there are certain limitations when you're using that service. Sentry is similar. This is the third-party service, but when you open the portal, you may have an impression that this is Azure service. It's not. It's offered by some third party, and the third party is responsible, for example, for your data security. But I wanted to talk about two different services which are delivered by Microsoft with some third-party partners, like Azure Red Hat OpenShift. For example, Azure Red Hat OpenShift Azure Red Hat needs to sit in two subnets which have open access to the internet when you are creating that service. And you cannot create any NSG, you cannot create any routing table. None of them can be assigned to these subnets, because otherwise Azure Red Hat OpenShift will not install in a proper way. How the Red Hat OpenShift is installed then? Well, the service is going through to 16 different domains, which are hosted by Akamai. So, and those are Red Hat, of course, domains, but they're hosted by Akamai, so they have different IP addresses used at the end of the day. And Red Hat, during the installation part, is using all those domains to download the binaries, to download the operators, to download the monitoring, to attach to the monitoring service with Red Hat. So you have plenty of those. So when you're using Azure Red Hat OpenShift or Databricks, because Databricks has some similar caveats, think carefully how you will harden those services before you will use them in your environment, because you may have different, you can see that you have, there are specific expectations for those services to be running. There are also things which you can do around that. So I encourage you to find a specialist for those type of services who can help you to validate the configuration, to harden the configuration, and help you configure the service at its best. And guys, because my time is running, I have only 3 minutes. I was able to cover those 4 areas, which I've hopefully showed you some couple of ideas where you should be careful when configuring those areas. So I was talking about governance services, external services. I was talking about SPNs, custom roles, networking, and Azure Id. And because we have just 3 minutes, let me jump to the Q&A slide. And let me check if I have any questions coming from you. So I may be able to answer them before we'll finish our session.